So, welcome everybody to this, which is the first session in Northern Heartland's online symposium, Heart of the Matter, and really the culmination of 3 years of being a Great Place scheme, but also the launch of what we hope will be a new era for Northern Heartlands as an independent CIO, charitable incorporated organisation, and we're hoping to embrace the digital age. So this is a great start, and a huge thank you to all of you for giving up what I know is very, very precious time, particularly at the moment. We're joined on today's panel by a really prestigious group of funders. We've got Andrew Barnett, who's the director of the Calouste Gulbenkian Foundation. The foundation is now in its second phase of its program, The Civic Role of Arts Organisations, following a massive inquiry across the country, which was launched way back in 2016. We have from Arts Council England, Helen Parrott, who's a senior manager and responsible for skills and workforce and strategic partnerships. Arts Council earlier this year launched its new 10-year strategy, Let's Create, and we're going to hear a bit more about that later. And that was after an in-depth consultation process, which was multi-phased, again, across the country. Dawn Plimmer, who's joined us, she is the head of practice at Collaborate CIC, and Collaborate helps public services work together to tackle complex social challenges. And Dawn is the co-author of a report called Exploring the New World, which provides practical examples and insights into the whole realm of funding and commissioning in complexity. David Rennick, who is Area Director North for the National Lottery Heritage Fund. NLHF last year published its 5-year strategic funding framework, setting out how the organisation is going to invest £1.2 billion in the UK's heritage. And last, but by no means least, we have Margaret Vaughan, who's the Chief Operating Officer at County Durham Community Foundation. The CDCF have been fabulous partners for Northern Heartlands throughout our lifetime, and they manage over 200 charitable funds on behalf of a whole variety of trusts and other independent and individual donors. And CDCF is this week celebrating its 25th anniversary. So happy birthday to Margaret and the CDCF. Welcome one and all. So funding in a time of uncertainty. We've had five-year strategies, 10-year strategies, months and months, if not years, of public consultation. And here we are now, emerging from lockdown in a time of unprecedented uncertainty. I think all funders here must certainly be commended for having responded so speedily to the COVID crisis. And I know you've all been working around the clock to invent new application procedures, assessment procedures, to help organisations, large and small, and individuals to prevent them from facing financial ruin in the last few weeks. We've got to the cliff edge. We're at the fence, but we don't quite know what's going to be beyond. What happens next? So we're here today to really talk about that, to talk about how we're going to face the next period of recovery and resilience, where those 5-year, 10-year strategies now stand, and also to explore some of the ideas that Dawn has been looking at and Collaborate CIC have been looking at in different approaches to how we manage the whole funding landscape. So I'm going to turn now to Helen Parrott from Arts Council England, and I think we're going to see a little film now about the 10-year strategy that is called Let's Create and is the result of so much consultation.
Let's create a country united by culture to be happier, healthier, excited, inspired, to make sense of our world, sense of ourselves, comforting the lonely, helping kids become grown-ups and grown-ups become kids again. Bringing us all together with the freedom to ask difficult questions and take a stand, to make your mark and make a difference, where your age, your colour and your bank balance don't matter, where it's about who you are, not where you're from, about what you do, not what you can't, for the change the worlders and the just for funners, the kids with ambition and the ambitious with kids, in villages, towns and cities, in playgrounds and packed concert halls, in rooms above pubs and festivals in fields, playing to crowds of thousands and audiences of one. Now, let's create.
A wonderful film.
I think it's quite important to say that this strategy is a successor to our first strategy, which covered the previous 10 years, and this is now our roadmap for the next 10 years. And although it was conceived in a pre-COVID world, it remains our roadmap. And I know people have been asking about that, but actually it is the way we're going to move forward. And the challenge obviously is how we find ourselves, how we move forward from the circumstances we find ourselves in, which is partly what we're here to talk about, and use that roadmap to take us to the future.
Yes, I think that is the question on everybody's lips. It's emergency, and now what? And are we going to go back to the system that we knew and loved, or is it too soon to do that? And I think I will bring in David Rennick here from NLHF, because equally you have a new strategy. Does it still apply? Everyone's still in emergency funding mode. Can we move straight from that into, or back to what we thought we knew in terms of funding processes and procedures? Or is there going to be an interim stage when we emerge from recovery? It seems to me that recovery or resilience was one thing during lockdown, but now there's a whole other period, which is about living with COVID, if you like, where the world isn't the world it was before. Where does NLHF stand on this?
Thanks, Jill. Well, I think firstly, it's great to be involved in this event today. I think the first thing I would suggest is that perhaps we have a chance to watch our short film about our strategic funding framework, and our framework sort of sets out how we will use National Lottery funding over the next 5 years. So if we could maybe run that film, and then perhaps I could try and answer that very big question after we've seen it.
Over the next 5 years, we will distribute over £1 billion of National Lottery money. So we asked National Lottery players where that money should go. They told us to support all kinds of heritage in every corner of the UK, and to make sure that heritage addresses social issues, supports well-being, and is enjoyed by the widest range of people. They also asked us to make landscapes and nature a priority, as well as the heritage of our diverse communities. So, over the next 5 years, we will stand up for heritage and the enormous good it does for our society. We will make heritage organisations more resilient, encouraging new partnerships, new ideas, and enterprising ways of doing things. We will attract others to invest alongside us, and when heritage is in danger of being lost, we will work hard to give it a future for people and communities to use and enjoy. We will make it easier to apply for funding, making sure our money gets to where it's needed as quickly as possible. More of our funding decisions will be made locally by people who live and work in their communities. And we will do all this under a new name, the National Lottery Heritage Fund. Making sure people know about the difference their money is making for people, heritage and communities.
In many ways, I think the film shows you that kind of, I mean, it's 1 year old, I must say. We're 1 year into our funding framework. So unlike the Arts Council, who launched their strategy very, very soon before COVID hit, we've probably had a little bit more time to see how that framework has landed and what it kind of means to us. And I think the context that we just need to flag here is that we haven't just changed our name and developed a new framework. We've changed the geography through which we work. We used to work through 9 English regions. We now have 3 English areas to complement the work that we do in the 3 countries. I think, therefore, we've changed a lot. And a big drive for that was to try and devolve more of our decision making down to those committees in areas and countries. So previously, about 40% of our money was actually spent through regional committees, and now we're delegating down 80%. So there's a greater chance to make that money land better and hit those strategic things that happen in local areas. So in the north of England, that's particularly relevant given the Northern Powerhouse and all of the levelling up agenda that hit before COVID and is probably exasperated by the impacts of COVID. So I think what you can probably see in the film is that not only we were trying to delegate that money down, but we were also trying to focus more and be more strategic than we've been in the past as a funder. We were focusing still on heritage at risk in all of its forms. We were focusing on community heritage, and we were focusing on inclusion. And we also prioritised nature and the environment, obviously incredibly important given the dual crises of ecological decline and climate change. We wanted to be more attuned to what would add value. And I think being innovative and moving from being more than a reactive project-based funder was part of that thinking. We'd already piloted some of that work through things like the Great Place scheme, collaboratively with the Arts Council and Historic England. And I think really where we probably see the framework moving now is even more to that kind of that place-based approach, where by working with local enterprise partnerships, by working through the Towns Fund, with government, with other funders, and with local communities, we can really make sure that art, heritage, culture plays a really strong role in informing over all of those plans. I think as a funder, we recognise we need to mobilise our money quicker. And I think the COVID crisis has really demonstrated that actually, when you need to, you can move very quickly. And so I think, in a way, lots of what's happening now has reinforced the need for what our framework articulated. It just means we've got to refocus it through a recovery and renewal lens. And that's the challenge. I think the answer to your question, Jill, is really it is quite soon in this process, and we shouldn't rush to try and design something that tries to meet the needs of the new world. We need to really listen, understand, as we have been, and really see what the sector needs before we actually kind of design that. And we can't do it alone. We've got to do it with our partners, and that's all funders, as well as government and with those local interests. And I think if we do move too quickly, we're likely to launch something that doesn't resonate and doesn't provide what we need. So I think that's probably a very long-winded way of saying we're not quite ready to give you that full, clear answer, but the picture is becoming clearer all the time. Thank you.
Thanks very much, David, and I think a very honest answer, and all the more credit for having both Arts Council and Heritage Fund having worked so quickly to respond in COVID. I used to work very briefly for the Arts Council myself, and I know the complexity involved in setting up those systems. And I think if there is a bit of time to think about what next, then that's all to the good. I think I'd like to hear now from Margaret about how the smaller, sort of more localized funders have been affected by what's happened. I know that the County Durham Community Foundation also had an emergency fund in response very quickly to the COVID crisis. Do you think that the independent, smaller funders, the donors that you work with, will change anything, adapt as a result of COVID, and be able to respond to the next phase?
Thanks, Jill. As a very local funder, I think we were in a great position to react very promptly. And I can confirm that many of our local donors were very attentive to broadening the criteria of maybe the funds that they hold with us, or actually handing us all the responsibility and saying, you know your communities on the ground locally. You're the one connected to the infrastructure organisations, the local public sector bodies. We trust you to do what is right at this time. And that's a mood that we are seeing continue in that very sort of core local donor base made up both of families and individuals, and in some cases corporates. In addition to that, the Community Foundation Network has been ideally placed to disperse money that was raised through the National Emergencies Trust. So that has meant in the North East, we've already awarded over £1 million in very small grants, so typically £3,000 or £4,000, to really small, local, volunteer-led groups who were able to deliver immediate response on the ground. For us now, what we're grappling with, as are David and Helen, I think, is how we evolve that model to recovery, resilience. What we know it won't be is going back to where we came from. Some of those groups actually will no longer be there in their same format. And we're seeing new groups often coming together through the power of social media, forming in our at a very local community level. So we need to work with them to bolster their abilities to deliver in the future and be part of the new world. So I think for us, we're evolving. We are grappling with responding to the needs that as they change almost weekly at a really grassroots level. So from emergency food to digital inclusion to opening up premises. And we're on that journey. And I think none of us quite know where that journey will end. If it ever ends, it may just become the new place that we are all in.
Thanks very much, Margaret, and interesting times indeed. I think it's been so fascinating in a way, watching what's happened in lockdown and how adaptable we've all been and had to be. And interesting that that the sort of the new localism, from clapping on streets and outside your front doors to, as you say, the groups that have sprung up in our local communities, but also how people have turned to arts and culture. And what a lifesaver it's been having access to that for those who are digitally connected. I think all of that's going to feed in a very interesting way into what Dawn Plimmer has to say. But before that, I'd like to go to Andrew Barnett, the director of the Kalis Gulbenkian Foundation. In my introduction, Andrew, I mentioned that the foundation is now in the second phase, I think, of the program, The Civic Role of Arts Organisations. A phenomenal amount of work went into the consultation phase for that. And of course, all of that happened pre-COVID. Has that world, the world has changed, but has it changed so significantly that that work may be differently processed, something different may happen, or are you still on the same path?
So I'd say that from the perspective of the Inclusive Gulbenkian Foundation, the principles, I think, remain the same. And I mean, as you know, we positioned that work in the form of a sort of inquiry. And the questions we asked at the time, and we were asking them of both arts organisations, but also very significant funders like the Arts Council, is how is it that arts organisations in the 21st century or the 2020s, 2030 can be relevant to the communities in which they are located? And it was based really on a premise that you know, there are a good number of arts organisations. You know, there's about 900 of them, which are hugely privileged in receiving year-on-year core support. So they're regarded as being essential parts, if you like, of the cultural infrastructure of our country. And with that privilege comes, I think, a responsibility really to understand who it is that they're for, and how they should be engaging with those communities to be the best they possibly can. So there's a sort of there's a standard really which needs to be met by those organisations if they're to continue to enjoy those privileges. So I think that the current situation provides us with, I mean, certainly a level of uncertainty. So, I mean, it could very well be that you know, if the government doesn't step in and at least provide some funding for the transition between, if you like, the old world and the new world, it may very well be that a lot of that infrastructure simply falls away, and that there aren't that many arts organisations of that kind that will be solvent. And you know, for any organisation, that is a challenge because we won't have organisations to work through. It does lead me, though, to I mean, first of all, praise the Arts Council, because I think it would be easy for an organisation, you know, in the year that it has launched a new 10-year strategy, to take 2 years to take a step back rather than to take a step forward. And I hugely welcome the fact that, you know, the work that went into Let's Create and is going to stand. And I hope that you know, collectively we see this as, you know, and I hate it because there's a sort of jarring positivity about it, but as an opportunity, if you like, to lean into that strategy and understand, as that strategy does, that creativity comes from all sorts of different places, and that that arts organisations, you know, perform a whole range of different roles. And you know, in the work that we did, we constructed these metaphors of arts organisations as town halls, colleges, and parks. And you know, there's really something about how can we apply some of those tests to the organisations that will enjoy funding in the future. Because the Arts Council is going to have to, with finite resources, at whatever level, make choices. And spreading your money, you know, sort of salami slicing it and spreading it thinly is going to probably mean that a larger proportion of the infrastructure will fall away than would otherwise be the case. So some choices are going to have to be made. And my hope is that those choices will be made on the basis of a genuine assessment as to the extent to which those organisations are truly relevant in their communities, so that we back the organisations of the future and don't simply sustain organisations that are stuck in the past.
Year after year, project after project, the Carlos Gulbenkian Foundation commits to people, preparing the citizens of the future. A perpetual foundation permanently renewing itself. Calouste Gulbenkian Foundation, a foundation for all humanity.
Andrew, thank you very much for that. And before we go to Dawn, Helen, I'm just wondering whether you'd like to come in back to Andrew on that. I'm aware that we may have some people in the audience listening to this who are not familiar with the national portfolio and the whole process of Arts Council's belief in regularly funding certain organisations, which is very different from Heritage Fund's approach.
Yeah, I mean, I agree, because when I first started working with National Lottery Heritage Fund colleagues, there was a moment of shock when I realised there was no equivalent in their worlds to our national portfolio, and what a status and a privilege those organisations are seen to hold. And you know, many of them discharge that beautifully and with a great deal of thought and consideration. And you know, the Gulbenkian work really spoke to that for me, and I found it very useful to have it set out with that kind of clarity. I think you're right that there are hard challenges ahead, and not all of the infrastructure will survive. We're not going to go back to the days we were in. We need to work out how we're going to move forward together to create whatever it is for all of us. And it's not just the arts and culture sector. This is a much wider issue for not just Britain, but the rest of the world. So we're at a very, very important moment, actually. And it's very hard to be specific about lots of the things people will want us to be specific about. So, you know, which programs are going to be available, which programs won't continue, all those things, it's just too soon to say. Sadly, it would be nice to be able to be that specific.
So if I could I just come? I mean, I think that that there are a number of issues. I mean, obviously that there are, you know, art often takes place in buildings, and you know, there are opportunities, I think, for buildings to have a range of different purposes, and you know, there's the possibility of moving towards you know, if you like, multi-purpose art centres. There's you know, it feels as though there was a time when we built lots of these things, and actually, you know, I think that a lot of those have the features that are maybe required of our times, in their agility to be able to program different things to operate rather differently. There's also, quite interestingly, you know, a growth in the number of, if you like, sort of fringe theatres, pop-up theatres and things like that. And there's something about that agility that we need to recognise and you know, acknowledge that that we, you know, as new organisations are born, you know, so old organisations sometimes should be allowed to die as well. So there's some level of churn, and it's not just layering more on top of the old. And I mean, I completely recognise that those sorts of decisions are extraordinarily difficult. And I mean, my hope is that people who live in communities will be engaged in some of those decisions, so that we can navigate through what are very, very choppy waters.
If I could come in there, I think as well. I mean, I think firstly, just to pick up on Andrew's point about arts happening in buildings, and I think, you know, obviously historic buildings, lots of arts organisations do operate from historic buildings, and so I think we've supported many of the kind of operations that Andrew, you talk about. In fact, I think there's a bigger appetite to actually support arts and cultural activities in buildings that also have a heritage value. Repurposing that old for new, not least is that incredibly sustainable, but it gives an inspiration and a kind of essence that actually stimulates the creative process, I would say, as well. So I think from that point, there are opportunities. And investing in places like that where they can play a key role in places in stimulating collaboration, bringing people together, I think is really important. And you only have to look at the success of Hull 2017, and now what's happening with legacy and where that moves next, and in terms of the role that maybe Absolutely Cultured as the successor body can play there. How does it move in? How does it fill? How does it create an infrastructure that will benefit lots of those more organic organisations to thrive and do what they do best, without being bogged down in some of the really detailed mechanical things that sometimes can stand in the way? So I think that's one thing, great opportunity there, I think. And then just to clarify on the role of the National Lottery Heritage Fund, if I might. So we're a UK-based funder. We're the largest funder of heritage in the UK, but we're not a development agency as the Arts Council are. We are a funder. However, we have a broader brief than our equivalent development agency partners. So effectively, Natural England are the equivalent of a development agency for nature and landscape, one of our priorities that we fund. And similarly, Historic England, the development agency, if you like, for England's heritage, built heritage particularly. We work with these other organisations to make sure that we are not the strategic lead, and the same is similar with the Arts Council with museums, where they are the strategic lead, but we are responsive to that strategic lead. And we are also strategically responsive to actually funding to bridge that gap between what happens on the ground, to put heritage in the mix and make the most of it in all of its forms, but also to kind of link in with those strategic directions. So that's kind of why we are slightly different. And I think that's often really missed and it's really important to understand, because it shows you why we work in the way we do and why Arts Council do, and how we can work together and complement each other, I think.
I'm going to bring Margaret in next. Buildings are obviously the visible face, but buildings have doors which can not just be entranceways, they can be barriers. There's a whole hidden element of the sectors we all work in, which are the people who live in the places. So I'm going to ask Margaret. I know Helen wants to say something about agility, and then we're going to come to Dawn. So Margaret.
I think it's been really fascinating as we've talked and shared how we've used the phrase place. Increasingly, I think COVID is teaching all of us that place can mean something more than a physical experience or building. I don't have the answers to what that means for us as funders, but I know that it's something that we are going to have to work through. As a lovely example locally here in the northeast of England, our great cathedral, Durham Cathedral, maybe shut its doors during COVID, yet held worship every day with people joining from throughout the globe for those experiences. Now, how we embrace that as funders at a really hyper-local level with our community buildings, and at a more national level with some of our great structures and places, I think is one that we haven't grappled with yet, but post-COVID, I think place will have to mean more than physical for us.
Thanks, Margaret. Helen, you wanted to respond, and then I'm going to go to Dawn.
Right. I just wanted to say, I think the point about being clear on the role and scope of the various funders and partners in any place is really important. So going back to David's point about the difference between National Lottery Heritage Fund and our own work, and indeed Historic England. But I think one of the things we have in common is that we really have responded really quickly and with great passion and commitment this time. And I've been really struck by what's possible when you have clarity. Because many of us are juggling multiple priorities all of the time. You know, we're reporting to different funders, whatever it is that we do. But actually, when it's very clear what needs doing, things get done. And I'm quite encouraged actually to discover that as bureaucracies, we really can do that. And how do we take that forward into the future? Because that's really exciting, that agility.
Right, well, I think now we're going to go to Dawn Plimmer, Collaborate CIC. So Dawn was co-author of a report called very appropriately, Exploring the New World. I'm sure when you wrote this, Dawn, you had no idea that the new world was going to come quite so quickly and in such a form as it has done. And a lot of the work that's been done by Collaborate, and in the earlier report, which was called A Whole New World, Funding and Commissioning in Complexity, which was published back in 2017, really challenges a lot of the premises on which our funding systems are based. So I'm looking forward to hearing what you've got to say. And I think after that, we'll open up the discussion to look at some of the big principles behind all of the work that we're doing. So Dawn, thank you.
Thanks, Jill. So yeah, I'm really pleased to be here today to kind of share that work we've been doing over the past few years on funding and commissioning and complexity. I'm definitely not an expert in the arts, and the work was not focused specifically on the arts, but I think we can already see by the kind of conversations we're already having that the idea of complexity is relevant and kind of across the funding landscape. So I wanted to talk a little bit about the work that we have been doing, looking at new approaches to funding and commissioning. And as Jill said, this was pre-COVID. We never could have anticipated how much complexity was coming. So I'm going to talk a little bit about why we think it's important to recognise complexity more, to work with complexity more. And that really touches on some ideas that have already come up today. And then also I'll talk a little bit about why COVID kind of reinforces this need for a complexity informed approach, and potentially how we hold on to some of that really great practice that Helen and others have talked about that we've seen in response to the crisis. So I've mentioned complexity a lot already, and the reason for that is kind of the reality of social change is complex. So all of our lives are complex, the social issues we work towards are complex, and the systems of support that exist around those issues are really, really complex as well. So that's the reason we're talking about complexity. That is the reality. And I just wanted to share a slide just to kind of bring to life what a complex system looks like in practice. So this slide, I'm sure a lot of people have already seen it, but it's a systems map of all the many factors that contribute to obesity. So there's over 100 factors that contribute to obesity. And really the purpose of showing this is to illustrate kind of how many factors are interacting together to contribute to obesity. The fact that these interact in unpredictable and ever-changing ways all the time. And perhaps most importantly, the fact that obesity, the factors that contribute to it, are beyond the control of any one actor in the system. So outcomes aren't delivered by organisations, they're not delivered by projects, they're not delivered by services. Outcomes emerge from complex systems. So I think already today we've talked a bit about collaboration, about the roles of funders in ecosystems. So I think one of the really important starting points for this work is outcomes are not delivered by organisations. And I think that throws up some really interesting questions for the role of funders, how they interact with the organisations they fund, and what can be expected of organisations working in complex systems on complex issues. And really for me, my personal interest and experience in this was kind of spending 10 years working for a range of different national and international funders, and just being frustrated that kind of traditional funding processes seem to restrict rather than enable the social change we wanted to see. So it's just one example, the idea that success was an organisation setting out their plan years and sticking to it, achieving those targets exactly, that was seen as success, whereas actually that didn't really chime. Those organisations weren't necessarily the ones that I was seeing doing the most effective work on the ground, having the biggest impact in people's lives. So I was frustrated, there was this niggling thoughts in my mind, well, this just doesn't make sense to me. And then working with Toby, our academic partner from Newcastle Business School on this work, it's like, Dawn, it's all because of new public management. So we've been used to working for so many years in a way where we try to kind of control social change in order to try and get good outcomes. So we focused on markets, creating competition as a way to improve outcomes. We focused on management, so trying to tightly control processes to create good outcomes. And we also focused on metrics, so measuring lots of things in order to try and create good outcomes. But if you look at that obesity diagram, if you look at the reality of the issues we're trying to address, we're increasingly recognising that you can't control social change, you can't control systems. So instead, when we spoke to funders, commissioners, charities and other organisations working in communities, what they told us we needed was the capacity to respond to variety of people's lives, of different communities, the ability to adapt to change, so that agility that we've heard so much about already, and the ability to shape systems. So no one can control a system, but we can think about how we work towards that shared purpose, how we coordinate, how we collaborate behind that shared purpose. So as we explored these ideas with funders, commissioners, with charities, we kind of identified 3 key features of how people were responding differently in complexity. So those features are firstly being human, secondly learning, and thirdly thinking about healthy systems. So I'm just going to really briefly touch on those 3 points, and hopefully it's something we can explore a bit more later. So when it comes to being human, everyone we spoke to in about the first 2 minutes kind of said some version of, it's just about being human really. So it being much more relational, putting people first, not process. So people talked about kind of responding to the variety of human need and experience, of putting empathy at the heart of our approaches, being much more relational in the way that we work. About coming from a strengths-based perspective, so instead of focusing on deficits, on focusing on what can we fix, how do we actually tap into people's interests, motivations, skills? And then finally, trust. I think, Jill, that was something you wanted to pick up later, but people spoke so much about trust. How can we trust people with decision making? How can, for example, funders and commissioners trust the organisations they fund much more? Within those organisations, how can leaders devolve much more decision making power to step on the ground? And in turn, how can professionals and practitioners and volunteers and communities trust the people that in the communities they're working with much more to do what's right for them? So as Margaret was talking about earlier, there's this big focus on devolving decision making. The best options to take are those working closest to the ground, the people who are actually grappling with that complexity day to day. So the idea of trust, the idea of devolving decision making really came out strongly from both funders, commissioners and charities and other local organisations. And just to give a brief example of what this looks like from a funding perspective, so I think the Blagrave Trust is really interesting. They support young people's transitions to adulthood and fund in the southwest of England. And their approach is being very relational as a funder, about multi-year core funding, very flexible, no application or monitoring forms. It's really kind of giving organisations the flexibility and the freedom to do what they think is right, to respond to the young people they work with, and really to kind of focus on listening to the voice of young people to drive their work. Then moving on to learning. So I guess COVID has made this more apparent than ever, but the context we're working in is always changing. So effective practice is actually not sticking to the plan for 3 years, but to be agile, to learn and adapt as we go, as the context changes. So I guess rather than in the past seeing innovation as something where you do a pilot, you see what works, and scale up something and do an evaluation at the end to say it's worked. Learning is much more this constant cycle of learning, of iteration. And what we've seen this mean for funders is funding for learning, not results. So instead of saying, tell me what targets you're going to hit in 3 years' time and we'll fund based on some nice looking numbers, instead it's funders choosing to fund those organisations that firstly are human, and secondly really show that they learn and adapt as the context changes, as people's lives change, as communities change. So really focusing on supporting those organisations who are agile, who do learn. Then the idea of creating a learning culture. So instead of funders driving competition, how instead can funders drive collaboration? How can they create spaces for learning? How can they create a culture which allows for honest learning rather than just saying what has worked? And my final point here is just, data is so important. So in all of this, I'm not saying that data and measurement is not important. It really, really is. And the organisations who are working in this way often are the most data-driven organisations. It's just shifting that emphasis slightly from how do we use measurement and targets to prove what we've done is successful, instead to thinking about how can we use data to help us learn, to help us adapt, to help us improve, and to do that together. And then finally, I just wanted to talk about systems. So as I mentioned with the obesity map, healthy systems produce good outcomes, not organisations, not projects, not services. So I think there's a really interesting question about kind of what role can funders best play in systems? How can they contribute to a healthy system? So as David and Helen, you've already picked up, there are different roles that funders can best play in an ecosystem. So in some cases, funders might be a local funder really embedded in the community, and they can play a really proactive role in trying to shape that system, trying to create the conditions for a healthy system. And so here, for example, the Barnwood Trust in Gloucestershire, it's a funder that's really well embedded, got great relationships across the place, and really plays kind of a system stewardship role, trying to create the conditions for healthy relationships, greater understanding, trying to shift the power dynamics locally and put communities at the forefront. But actually not all funders can do that. If you're not locally based, if you don't have those relationships, if you fund at a national level, for example, you know, it's not your role as a funder. You don't have that local insight. You don't have that trust. So instead, a funder like the Tudor Trust, for example, they really try to understand the systems their grant holders are part of and enable their grant holders to navigate that system as best they can. They really give that trust in those organisations and the flexibility to enable them to navigate the system. So I think here there's a really interesting question about, firstly, what role can individual funders best play in that complex ecosystem? And I suppose in direct response to COVID, I'd say kind of it's made the case for us thinking about complexity more than ever. It's shown the need for flexibility, for agility, for trust, for trusting the organisations that we fund, perhaps kind of more mutual accountability between funders and the organisations we fund. And as we've highlighted, there really has been some brilliant, quick, adaptive practice in response to COVID the last few months. So how can we hold on to that instead of snapping back to traditional funding practices? How do we embrace what's really worked over the last few months? And perhaps, you know, we can have 10-year strategies, but maybe it's about making them emergent, maybe it's about emergent strategy, maybe it's about putting complexity at the heart of those strategies rather than trying to predict what comes. So be more principles focused, more learning focused, as opposed to trying to predict the uncertainty that lies ahead. Thank you.
Dawn, thank you very much indeed. There's so much there to unpack and to talk about, and we have only got limited time. But we're really lucky to have round the table or on the screen representatives from very different funders. We've got a foundation, 2 lottery distributors, and a community foundation which works at a very local level. So I'm going to give you all the opportunity to respond and let us know how your organisation might respond to some of the provocations from Dawn. But I'm going to go first to Andrew and find out how you feel the Calouste Gulbenkian Foundation fits or otherwise into some of the thinking behind what Dawn has said.
So first of all, I'd like to say how much I welcome Dawn's work. And indeed, the Calouste Gulbenkian Foundation co-founded Collaborate. You know, that in a sense is one of the roles that we perform, which is to try and create the conditions within which some of this thinking can emerge. I would agree with almost everything she said, actually, which is, and I'm famous for my alliterations. So if you will forgive me or indulge me, you know, all of this begins with people. And I really welcome the fact that she has, in her thinking, suggested that we should all put people first, and in particular acknowledge the real value of taking a relational approach to the many issues which that we need to try and address. And I'll run through my other P's really. So people is at the heart of it, but the second really is about positioning. And I think that the understanding that each of us is, I think, gaining about where we sit in the ecology, I think is really important, because we are different. We have different scales, we have different mandates, we have sometimes different geographic focuses, and understanding where we are positioned in a wider ecology is hugely important. And being self-aware enough to understand what we're really good at, and therefore being able to focus on that so that we can collaborate or align with others so that the whole can be greater than the sum of the parts is I think really important. But the third thing would be about purpose and having real clarity of purpose. And I think, you know, from focus follows purpose. And then, you know, where I again completely agree with Dawn is it's about principles. And you know, the idea that learning is very often based on the fact that we can fail as well as succeed, I think is really important, and to give people that scope, the flexibility within which to put purpose and principles at the heart of things, rather than tying everything up in very complex processes, which has very often in the past been the way in which funders have operated. You know, it's all about criteria rather than those principles. And you know, principles really are all about values. And you know, I think that increasingly we acknowledge that actually the way that, you know, we should manage things is as much through what is achieved as the values and therefore the behaviours that we exhibit. So I love the way that we have put, and Dawn emphasises this, that it's people before processes.
Thanks very much, Andrew. Yes, so much interesting stuff there. And I'd be really interested to hear from Arts Council. 10-year strategy. Does that mean you're stuck? You've got to do this thing and you can't be flexible? Or how does Dawn's provocation work within that framework? Helen.
Okay. No, we're not stuck, and we're definitely not inflexible. The strategy is the vision, I would say, and underneath that there will be some delivery plans. And we were planning to publish a delivery plan by now. Life has got in the way, so that process will be delayed. And the new delivery plan will cover what we're calling, we have various phases of the response to COVID, what we're calling the reset phase, I think. I'll check that. And therefore, each delivery plan will be freestanding, and it will respond to the next 3 or 4 years, depending on what it is that we decide in relation to funds available. And that leads me neatly to the other aspect of the ecology, which is, yes, we all have different roles and different geographies, and understanding those are important, but it's also important to understand where the money comes from. Different funders have different reasons for funding. And unless people understand why a funder is interested in whatever activity is, it's very hard to move forward. And actually, public accountability for public funds is really important to us and does drive a lot of the things that we're doing around evaluation and metrics. I'm curious as to what other folks might think about that one.
You're absolutely right that motivation is really important, and that comes from, I use another P, provenance really, which is, you know, where is the where does the organisation come from? Whose money is it? And I think, you know, understanding those motivations is really important.
Yes, I agree, and I think as somebody who's filled out a lot of funding application forms, and coming at it from the side of the funded as well as the funder, I think what Dawn said about trust is also so important. I have in my time answered a question which said, what will change as a result of your project? And I so much wanted to put, I don't know, but something will. And that issue of, or that notion of failure, it's never failure. It's always a work in progress. It's trying something out. Trust those who do it. Trust those who know their communities. Trust those who know their work to be able to try things out. I'm going to go to David now and ask about the Heritage Fund's response and how flexible, how agile, how trusting you feel this massive organisation with a massive amount of money can be. David.
Thank you, Jill. Firstly, we're not that big an organisation, I might say. You know, we've got a team of 40 or so people for the whole of the north of England. And I think just in context, you know, distributing, 45 million pounds is the budget we had across the north of England in last financial year. And, that's a lot of money. And I think it sounds like a very boring point when we've heard so much inspiring provocation to say that actually we do have to think about how we work, what resource we've got to deliver it. And so balancing this thing about being responsive, flexible, involved, trusting, whilst at the same time having probity by being transparent, all of that has to be mixed up, and we need to come up with a recipe that works for all those things, I would say. I mean, I think empathy is something is massively understated and undervalued. And I would say empathy, both from us as a funder to the people who will benefit from our funds, those who want to access our funds, the national lottery players who buy tickets and what their motivations are, and the world at large, and for us as a team, empathy cross-cuts everything we do, and we could probably more avert about that. We're doing lots of work internally to make sure that's reflected in our values as a funder. I mean, I think we are more flexible and agile than we have been. That's a journey we are still on. COVID has been a real stimulus for that innovation and for changing cultures and resetting relationships and all those kind of things. What's been the most important thing so far is our ability to listen, our ability to ask people what they think, they need, they want, what their challenges are. And even if we can't help them, we can give a sensitive ear, which will help them in some way get to where they need to be. Now, we obviously hope that we were able to fund them and support their work as well. And we have done in many instances. So going out, doing research quickly, responsively on attitudes before we launched our Heritage Emergency Fund, actually doing bits of additional research where we felt we had gaps, and then designing our program on the basis of that. We managed to do all of that. I mean, it's not perfect, but hopefully it means what we offered landed better. I think in our normal approach and our new normal approach, I think it's really important we keep those things in mind. We've done quite a bit of work to pilot how we reach communities at the much more micro community level. So we did a pilot in Barrow where we gave micro grants much more conversationally. We got groups in, we talked to them, we tried to understand where heritage could play a role, and where there was a genuine idea, we funded those quickly, we made them happen. We did some evaluation, it was great. We were just about to actually widen that approach by doing some targeted micro grants, piloting in Sheffield and on the Durham coast. And we want to get back to that. We've tried to mix up our approach in how we offer support to smaller groups. So funding fairs are great, but really what we tend to get with funding fairs is a passive audience going around the tables, collecting the leaflets, and they might be stimulated to do a heritage project. Do we get the best heritage projects out of those conversations? Yes, we do get some really good ones, but I think we want to move to a more involved conversation, which is genuinely listening to people who have an idea, supporting them to do that and making that happen. But we can't do it everywhere. We don't have the staff time. So I think thinking about how do we empower others to reach communities in meaningful ways is crucial to our work. So one of the things we introduced in our funding framework was much more delegated schemes, where we would invest a chunk of our money in a wider program to allow a trusted organisation to run with and work with communities to do that real co-production. And then we've also learned at the bigger project scale about our ability to take a risk. So I mentioned Hull 2017 earlier on. When we went into that project, we didn't know what we would get out of it. We trusted in an effective framework that would put heritage at the core of a creative programme. And I think by working with the Arts Council and other partners, we've been able to get a really powerful result, far more powerful than we could have imagined at the beginning. And that's because we took a risk. Now, how do we do that more in other programmes? And it's got to be something about us still getting that sense of credibility, that the conversations that grantees are having with funders are meaningful. They've been had, they understand those communities. And so I think us trying to maybe have those conversations where we can understand that trust is there, that the community is bought into what's been done, have been listened to, and will go on a journey, rather than they've been sold an idea and some of them have signed up, they are very different things. And I think we're still learning about how we do that. So there's loads of other things that's been discussed. I think the framework, the diagram, is a very, very interesting prompt for future discussion. So I'll leave it there for now.
Thank you very much indeed, David. And I just want to come in myself, actually, as a Great Place scheme, a recipient of significant monies through Arts Council and the Heritage Fund. But what we've also done is managed our own small grant scheme with the support of the County Durham Community Foundation. And that has been such a strength and such a success. So this notion of having the middleman, if you like, the intermediary, because what we had was we had 2 community facilitators who absolutely knew those communities on the ground, worked with them, gave them the opportunities to apply for the funding, and then work with them once they've been given the funding to help them manage their projects. And it has been phenomenally successful. So I think I'd just like to come to Margaret there and have your take on it, Margaret, as well.
Thanks, Jill. We've already mentioned the ecology of the funding landscape, and I think that's one of our untapped jewels that as funders we need to tap into more. And Jill's example of how we as a very local grassroots funder could partner with Northern Heartlands, and the whole was far stronger than what we could have delivered separately. In fact, I don't think we as a community foundation could have delivered the creative community grants that ultimately were delivered in partnership. So the ecology of who has which knowledge, where relationships are held, I think is key for this brave new world. And then coming back to Dawn's sort of starting premise about humans, it's all about people. I think as a local funder, that's where we start. This is about people that we know. It's also about people that we know who wish to give. And we've reflected that sometimes funders have very specific criteria. I think one of the places that funders can improve is to encourage their funders or donors to see a bigger picture, to understand what needs are there and how they can be supported through funding and other activities. And we see that very much as our role. We don't see our role just to grant award funds, we see it to engage with those who potentially are able to give. So it's all about people, it's all about connecting people, and once you've connected people, then you build the trust, and then you can take the risks in your grant making at a local level.
Thanks, Margaret. So I think we're going to finish with Dawn, and who's going to come back in some of the points that have been raised. So Dawn.
Thanks, Jill. I don't think I can come back to all those really insightful comments. The 2 that really stood out for me is that point about being relational. And David, yeah, I think that's a really good point. That relational funding takes a lot of capacity. So yeah, it's not always possible at all times to be as relational as you might want to be. I used to work at the National Lottery Community Fund, and how do you be a relational funder when you're giving out 13,000 grants a year? It's a really tough call. So I think, Margaret, the point you're making about how do big national funders partner with local funders, local organisations? How do we build that trust so those local organisations can really build on that local knowledge and relationships? Really, really interesting point, and something that is one of the things actually I've been most impressed with in the COVID response, how different types of funders have really pulled on their strengths and help them help enable a response that works better for communities. And the second point I thought was really interesting is that kind of question about, so how are we accountable for public money? So just to kind of share some of the ideas that funders and commissioners have spoken to us about. so one of the ideas is kind of, so who is what do you hold organisations accountable for? So you can hold organisations accountable for targets, for outcomes, but actually, as I said, you can't hold a single organisation accountable for something that's beyond their control. So instead, how do you start to think a bit differently about what you can hold people accountable for? So is it more accountability for learning, accountability for the health of the system, accountability for relationships and connecting, that kind of side of things. I think also kind of what counts as evidence as well. So actually in some cases a quantitative metrics, less useful. In some cases, do we need to value stories more, see accountability as a dialogue, those kind of co-production processes that we've mentioned. And then I think perhaps most importantly is like, so who are we accountable for? So historically we've been accountable upwards to funding committees, to boards, to regulators, but actually how do we try to create a different kind of accountability, which is accountable to a broader range of stakeholders, whether it's to the frontline practitioners who are actually delivering the support, whether it's to people actually accessing support themselves. So I think, yeah, that point someone mentioned about seeing the bigger picture, how can we think about accountability in that broader picture, more about transparency, more about co-production, more about trust. And I guess getting traditional decision makers and the people who receive this information to perhaps take that broader view to help them think about, actually, is accountability for working? Is it supportive of the end goal that we want to work towards? If not, how can we rethink what accountability is for and who that accountability needs to be to? So don't have any answers, but I think there's some really interesting examples of funders, commissioners really exploring, experimenting, and I guess really taking decision makers with them on that process and getting them involved in co-production processes to see actually we can do this a different way. There is a different way of understanding what works, what matters to people locally.
Dawn, thank you very much indeed. I know you've all got plenty to say still, and we could, as I say, just go on because there's so much here that's interesting and really, really important. This is just the beginning of a whole new dawn. Thank you again very much indeed.